The Colonial Brotherhood of Assassins is one of the most tragic stories in the entire franchise. Built from nothing, destroyed from within, and rebuilt by a man who had every reason to walk away. Today I'm breaking down the complete history of the Colonial Brotherhood, from its founding to its fall to its resurrection. And it starts with a man most people have never even heard of, the founding by John de la Tour. Around 1740, the French Brotherhood Council gave a man named John de la Tour a single mission: go to New France, establish an assassin network, and figure out what precursor sites were hiding across the colonial territories. He set up in Acadia and got to work, quietly building intelligence on ancient Isu locations scattered throughout the region. Not exactly glamorous, but the guy took it seriously. Then he met Achilles Davenport. De la Tour was a French-Canadian operative with deep knowledge of precursor sites. Davenport was a Caribbean-trained assassin with the combat skills to actually do something with that knowledge. The two basically said, yeah, we could build something real here. Not a French network or a British one. A unified brotherhood that ignored colonial borders entirely. By the mid-1740s, they'd formed a genuine partnership, tracking Isu artifacts and building contacts across the colonies. De la Tour brought the intelligence. Achilles brought the muscle. And along the way, Achilles met Abigail, who would become his wife. The entire emotional foundation of the Colonial Brotherhood was being laid alongside the strategic one. Then came the siege of Louisbourg in 1745, and this is where de la Tour's story ends. With British forces closing in and Davenport still trying to escape with precursor documents, de la Tour attacked the British troops alone, one man against an army, buying time with his life. Before he died, he formally named Davenport as mentor and handed over his ceremonial robes. Here's the thing. His total presence in the lore is incredibly brief, but every single thing the Colonial Brotherhood became, every victory, every failure, all of it traces back to the decisions this one man made in a handful of years. He picked the right partner, found the right information, and died at exactly the right moment. But the man he chose to carry that torch, he's about to build an empire and then watch it burn to the ground. Achilles Davenport's leadership. Achilles Davenport didn't just lead the Colonial Brotherhood, he built it from nothing. Trained under the legendary Caribbean mentor Atabai himself, Davenport took the torch from the fallen John de la Tour in 1746 and established the Davenport homestead in Massachusetts as the Brotherhood's new headquarters. And then he got to work. By 1752, barely 6 years in, the man had assembled something terrifying. Forts, settlements, spy networks, gang operations, stretching from the river valley to the North Atlantic. The Colonial Brotherhood had become the most powerful assassin presence in all of colonial North America, which is, not bad for half a decade, and the recruits he pulled in were no joke. Liam O'Brien, inducted back in 1743, became his right hand. Hope Jensen, an orphaned thief, built criminal networks across New York like she was franchising them. Chevalier de la Vérendrye brought French military connections to the table, and then there was Shea Cormac, recruited around 1748 for his skills on the water. At the time, he seemed like a perfect fit. We'll get back to that. But here's where it gets complicated. Achilles lost his wife Abigail and his son Connor, and that grief didn't just change him, it rewired him. He became obsessed with using the precursor box and the Voynich manuscript to locate ancient structures called seismic temples. On paper, it looked like ambition. In practice, it was a man trying to fill a hole that couldn't be filled and dragging an entire brotherhood toward the edge of a cliff without realizing it. That's the tragedy of Achilles Davenport. Brilliant organizer, genuine visionary. Built a golden age with his bare hands. But the moment his purpose shifted from protector to power seeker, the clock started ticking on everything he'd created, and those precursor sites he was so desperate to find, they're about to become the single biggest mistake in Brotherhood history: the search for the precursor sites. The Colonial Brotherhood wasn't just running around stabbing Templars. They had a bigger mission, one that would eventually destroy them from the inside out. And it all started with a box. The precursor box was an Isu device, a piece of ancient technology that, when paired with the Voynich manuscript, could project a global map showing the locations of first civilization temples scattered across the world. For the Brotherhood, this was the ultimate strategic asset, a literal treasure map to power that predated human civilization. Achilles and his leadership believed these sites contained pieces of Eden, artifacts that could tip the balance of the entire Assassin-Templar War permanently in their favor. Here's the thing, they were wrong. Not about the temples existing. Those were real. They were wrong about what the temples actually did. In 1751, the Saint-Domingue mentor François Macandal used the precursor box and manuscript to locate a temple near Port-au-Prince. He sent an operative named Vendredi to investigate. Vendredi reached the temple's core, disturbed its central component, and triggered a massive earthquake that leveled Port-au-Prince and killed thousands of people. Vendredi himself was caught in the destruction and never made it out, which is, not ideal. These weren't weapon vaults. They were seismic temples, part of a vast underground network built by the ISU to stabilize the Earth's crust. Think of them as geological support beams holding the planet together. You pull one out, the ground doesn't politely rearrange itself. It collapses violently on top of everyone. Now, this should have been the moment where the entire Brotherhood stopped, looked at the smoking crater where a city used to be, and said maybe we should not do that again. But they didn't. Achilles and the Brotherhood leadership chalked it up to natural causes. A coincidence. Bad luck. They had a map to God-level technology, and they weren't about to stop following it because of one earthquake, no matter how many people it killed. That failure of intellectual humility, that refusal to connect the dots when the dots were screaming at them, would cost the Brotherhood everything. Because Port-au-Prince wasn't the last temple they'd crack open, and the next one would be so much worse. The 1755 Lisbon earthquake. Achilles sent Shea to Lisbon, Portugal. The mission was simple. Infiltrate an Isu complex hidden beneath the Carmo convent, locate what Davenport believed was a piece of Eden, and bring it home. Standard retrieval job. Nothing the Brotherhood hadn't done before. But when Shea reached the heart of the temple, he found something familiar. Too familiar. The structure was identical to the seismic temple in Port-au-Prince, the same one that had already caused an earthquake and killed thousands just 4 years earlier, and the Brotherhood knew about that disaster. They knew what had happened when the last person disturbed one of these sites. Shea followed his orders anyway. He removed the core component from its pedestal, and the thing immediately disintegrated in his hands, which is, not ideal. The entire complex began collapsing around him, and within minutes, the disturbance triggered an earthquake exceeding magnitude 8.5, one of the most destructive seismic events in recorded European history. Lisbon was leveled. Thousands of people were dead before the dust even settled. Churches, homes, entire neighborhoods, just gone. And Shea had to crawl out of the rubble knowing that he did that the Brotherhood told him to do that. He barely made it back to the homestead alive, and when he got there, he begged Achilles to stop. Stop searching for precursor sites. Destroy the Voynich manuscript. Never send another assassin into one of these temples again. His argument was about as straightforward as it gets. We just killed an entire city. Maybe we should stop doing the thing that kills entire cities. The Brotherhood's response? They didn't believe him. The entire leadership dismissed his eyewitness testimony and his moral objections as insubordination. Not a single senior assassin backed him up. Here's the thing, Shea's position wasn't radical. It wasn't even controversial. Protect the innocent. That's literally the foundation of the Assassin Creed. He was asking the Brotherhood to follow its own rules, and they treated him like a traitor for it. The organization that existed to defend free will and human life had just flattened a European capital and then criminalized the one guy who said maybe we shouldn't do that again. That's the moment the Colonial Brotherhood sealed its own fate. They just didn't know it yet, because Shea wasn't going to let this go, and what he did next would make Lisbon look like a footnote. Shea Patrick Cormac's betrayal. Before Shea Cormac became the most dangerous enemy the Colonial Brotherhood ever faced, he was one of its best. Between 1752 and 1754, Shea personally assassinated 3 high-ranking Templars, Lawrence Washington, Samuel Smith, and James Wardrop. He was the second best sailor in the entire Colonial Brotherhood. The guy was a weapon, and he was pointed directly at the Templar Order. Then Lisbon happened. We already covered what went down in that seismic temple, but what matters here is what came after. Shea didn't just feel bad about Lisbon, he was destroyed by it. Thousands of people died because he followed orders, and when he came back begging the Brotherhood to stop chasing precursor sites, they told him to sit down and shut up. His conscience was treated like insubordination. So Shay made a choice. He attempted to steal the Voynich manuscript, not because he wanted power, but because he genuinely believed it was the only way to prevent another city from being leveled. The man was trying to save lives, and the Brotherhood tried to kill him for it. When Achilles discovered the theft, there was no conversation, no tribunal, no attempt to understand why one of their most loyal operatives had just committed the most desperate act of his life. They pursued Shay with lethal force. His former brothers hunted him across the colonies like an animal. Cornered, betrayed by the only family he'd ever known, Shay contacted Grand Master Haytham Kenway and offered his services to the colonial right. And here's where it gets truly tragic. Everything Shay knew about the Brotherhood, every safe house, every operative, every strategy, he handed all of it over. He didn't just switch sides, he became the single most devastating weapon the Templars had ever possessed. From 1757 to 1760, Shay systematically hunted down and killed his former colleagues, Kesegoas, Hope Jensen, Chevalier de la Vérendrye, even Adewale, the legendary Caribbean assassin who'd been fighting Templars since before Shay was born. He knew exactly how they thought, how they moved, where they'd hide. The thing that makes Shay so difficult to categorize is that he's not a villain who turned evil. He's a man whose conscience was punished. Every kill he made as a Templar was a former friend, and every one of those kills was preventable if the Brotherhood had just listened. If Achilles had just considered the possibility that the guy who watched Lisbon collapse had a point, but they didn't. And Shay didn't stop until there was almost nothing left to destroy. Which brings us to what happened when the Templars finally came for the homestead itself, the siege of the Davenport homestead. By 1760, the Colonial Brotherhood was already dead. It just hadn't stopped breathing yet. The Arctic had taken everything. Liam O'Brien, Achilles' most loyal friend and the last real fighter the Brotherhood had left, was killed at a precursor vault buried in the frozen north. Shay Cormac put him down. And while Liam bled out on the ice, Haytham Kenway turned his attention to Achilles himself, shattering his leg so badly the man would never walk right again. But Haytham didn't kill him. He let Achilles live on one condition. The Brotherhood would abandon every single Isu temple search, effective immediately. No more precursor sites, no more artifacts, no more anything. Achilles accepted. What else was he going to do? For 3 years after that, the mentor lived in enforced purgatory at the Davenport homestead. Still alive, technically still an assassin, but forbidden from acting like one. The surviving members scattered like roaches when the lights come on. Pierre Balek fled all the way to France, haunted by what he'd witnessed during the Purge. The Templars had burned entire villages to the ground just for the chance of killing a single assassin hiding among the population. Balek saw that firsthand. He never forgot it. But the Templars weren't satisfied with a broken mentor and a handful of fugitives. They wanted extinction. In 1763, they got as close as anyone ever has. A full-scale assault hit the Davenport homestead. Every remaining assassin present was killed. Every single one. The only survivors were Achilles and Robert Faulkner, and even that wasn't guaranteed until Shay Cormac personally stepped in. Here's where it gets complicated. Shay, the man who had betrayed the Brotherhood, who had hunted his former brothers across the continent for years, asked Haytham Kenway to spare his old mentor's life, and Haytham agreed. But the terms were absolute. Achilles would live only if he abandoned his identity as an assassin forever. No rebuilding, no recruiting, no hope. Achilles accepted again, because again, what choice did he have? And so the once ambitious mentor of a continental brotherhood became a depressed, embittered recluse in a crumbling house. The homestead rotted around him, the paint peeled, the floorboards warped, and Achilles sat inside alone for 6 years. A man who had commanded networks stretching from Canada to the Carolinas, reduced to staring at walls and waiting to die. That image is one of the most quietly devastating moments in the entire franchise. No dramatic cutscene, no orchestral swell, just an old man and the ruins of everything he built. But if you think the Brotherhood story ends in that crumbling house, you haven't been paying attention. Because what the Templars did to the assassins across the rest of the colonies was somehow even worse. The Great Purge of the Colonial Brotherhood. Let's pull back and look at the full picture, because what happened to the Colonial Brotherhood between 1757 and 1763 wasn't a war. It wasn't a series of unfortunate events. It was an extermination. Haytham Kenway didn't just want to beat the assassins, he wanted to erase them. Every safe house, every recruit, every supply line, every ally, every scrap of infrastructure that allowed the Brotherhood to function as an organization. The Templars went after all of it, systematically, methodically, and with a level of precision that should have been impossible for an outside force. But here's the thing, they weren't working with outside intelligence. Shay Cormac knew everything. He knew the names. He knew the faces. He knew which operatives worked which routes, which safe houses were active, which harbors the Brotherhood used to resupply. He knew their training methods, their communication protocols, their individual habits and weaknesses. Every single advantage the Colonial Brotherhood had built over a decade of careful expansion became a vulnerability overnight, because the one person who understood the entire machine was now working for the people trying to destroy it, and destroy it they did. Between 1757 and 1760, Shay personally hunted down and killed Kesegoase, Hope Jensen, Chevalier de la Vérendrye, and even Adewale, the legendary Caribbean assassin who had survived decades of conflict only to die at the hands of a former brother. These weren't random kills. These were surgical removals of leadership, each one collapsing another section of the network. The Templars didn't just assassinate people, they burned safe houses. They dismantled recruitment pipelines. They made it impossible for the Brotherhood to train new members, coordinate operations, or even communicate between cells. By 1760, the Arctic Temple confrontation had left Liam O'Brien dead and Achilles Davenport permanently crippled. By 1763, the final assault on the homestead killed every remaining assassin except Achilles and Robert Faulkner. That's it. That's what was left. A crippled old man, a ship captain, and a handful of scattered survivors who had abandoned their identities just to stay alive. The most powerful assassin organization in the Western Hemisphere reduced to nothing in 6 years, which is, not ideal. But what made the purge truly devastating wasn't just the body count, it was the totality. The Templars didn't leave behind a weakened brotherhood that could recover in a few years. They left behind a void. No leadership structure, no training infrastructure, no institutional knowledge being passed down. The Brotherhood didn't just lose the war, it ceased to exist as a functioning entity, and that void would persist for years until the 7 Years' War reshaped the entire continent and created conditions nobody saw coming. The 7 Years' War aftermath. The Templars won. That's the short version. The long version is so much worse because the Templars won and then immediately started losing, and they did it to themselves. The 7 Years' War, known in the colonies as the French and Indian War, ran from 1754 to 1763 and reshaped the entire continent. But for the Assassins and Templars, it wasn't just a war between empires, it was the backdrop for everything. Every assassination, every betrayal, every burned safe house during the Great Purge happened while musket fire echoed across the frontier. Here's how the sides broke down. The Colonial Brotherhood aligned with French interests and indigenous peoples, defending communities that stood to lose everything under British expansion. The Templars, under Haytham Kenway, backed Britain, not because they cared about King George. Haytham's logic was brutally simple. If Britain dominated North America, the Templars could use British authority to enforce centralized control over every colony on the continent. One empire, one hierarchy, one order pulling the strings, and it worked. Britain's victory was comprehensive. France ceded all its North American territory east of the Mississippi through the Treaty of Paris in 1763. The Brotherhood's allies were gone. Their networks among French settlers and indigenous nations were scattered. The Templars controlled the winning side of a continental war while simultaneously finishing the Great Purge. On paper, total Templar victory. But here's where it gets complicated. Fighting a war across an entire continent is not cheap. Britain had racked up massive debts, and somebody had to pay. So Parliament looked at the colonies they'd just spent a fortune defending and said, "You're welcome. Here's your tax bill, the Stamp Act, the Townshend Acts, new duties, new restrictions." And the colonists, who had just watched their neighbors die in a war they didn't start, were not exactly thrilled about being squeezed by a government that gave them zero representation. The resentment created something the Templars never anticipated: a unified colonial identity built entirely on resistance to the very British authority they'd spent a decade strengthening. That's the irony that makes this whole period fascinating. The Templars engineered a British victory to consolidate control over North America. But that victory generated the exact conditions for colonial rebellion: the taxes, the overreach, the growing sense that the colonies were being exploited rather than governed. All of it traced directly back to war debts from a conflict the Templars helped win. They planted the seeds of their own defeat and didn't even realize it. The American Revolution, the very conflict that would resurrect the Brotherhood they'd just finished destroying, was a direct consequence of the Templars' greatest triumph, which is, not ideal, but the revolution needed a spark, and more importantly, it needed an assassin, one who happened to be the son of the man who built the colonial right in the first place. Connor Kenway's training. Picture this: a teenage Mohawk warrior, barely old enough to shave, standing on the doorstep of a rotting manor house in the middle of nowhere, Massachusetts. Inside is a crippled old man who hasn't spoken to another human being in 6 years. This is the moment the Colonial Brotherhood comes back from the dead. Ratan Naketun was born on April 4th, 1756, and his parents read like a bad joke. His father was Hatham Kenway, Grand Master of the Colonial Templars. His mother was Kanyedi.io, a Kanyan-Kahaka warrior who wanted nothing to do with Hatham's world. Connor grew up in the Mohawk village of Kanatasitan, completely unaware of his father's identity and completely unaware of the war between assassins and Templars. In 1760, Charles Lee's forces burned the village. Connor was 4 years old. His mother didn't make it out. That single event carved a path through the next decade of his life. Guided by the Isu entity Juno and advice from his tribal elder Oya Nair, Connor eventually learned that the tools he needed to protect his people existed outside his village. Around 1769, he made the journey to the Davenport homestead to find the last assassin in the colonies. What he found was a ruin. Achilles Davenport was crippled, depressed, bitter, and utterly done with the Brotherhood that had gotten everyone he loved killed. He told Connor to leave, multiple times. The old man had watched his entire organization get systematically dismantled. Training some kid to go die the same way everyone else did was not on his to-do list. But Connor didn't leave, and eventually Achilles broke. Here's the detail that gets me. When Achilles finally agreed to train him, he gave Ratan Naketun a new name, Connor, after his own dead son. A grieving old man names his last student after the child he buried. That's not a tactical decision. That's a man deciding to hope again, which is honestly the bravest thing anyone does in this entire story. And Achilles didn't just teach him how to stab people, colonial politics, financial management, the philosophical foundations of the creed itself. He'd seen what happened when the Brotherhood operated without understanding the world around it, and he was determined not to repeat that mistake. By 1773, the investment paid off. When Templar William Johnson attempted to purchase Iroquois lands, including Connor's home territory, Connor tracked him to Boston entirely on his own initiative. No orders from Achilles, no grand strategy session. He identified the threat, assessed the situation, and moved. That's not a student following instructions. That's a leader making decisions. The Colonial Brotherhood, which had been literally one broken man in a collapsing house, now had a future. But having a future and surviving long enough to use it are two very different things, especially when the revolution is about to explode and the Templars have infiltrated the Continental Army itself. The Battle of Monmouth, June 28, 1778, New Jersey. Over 100 degrees on the battlefield, soldiers collapsing from heat stroke before a single shot was fired. And somehow this wasn't even the worst part of the day. Here's the situation. The British Army under General Clinton was retreating from Philadelphia toward New York, dragging a baggage train 12 miles long through the New Jersey countryside. Washington saw an opportunity to hit them while they were strung out and vulnerable. The plan was simple. Major General Charles Lee would take a 5,000-man vanguard, slam into the British rear guard before Clinton could consolidate. Washington's main body would follow behind, ready to reinforce once Lee had the British pinned. Simple enough. Except Charles Lee had zero intention of making it work. Lee's advance was hesitant from the start, poorly coordinated, indecisive, the kind of military leadership that looks less like caution and more like sabotage. Instead of pressing the attack while the British were stretched thin, Lee allowed his forces to stall, giving British General Cornwallis enough time to wheel around and launch a devastating counterattack. What was supposed to be an American pursuit turned into an American retreat. 5,000 Continental soldiers, the best Washington had, on the verge of being routed in open field, and then Lee tried to finish the job. Mid-battle, with his own forces already buckling, Lee attempted to order a full general retreat. Not a tactical withdrawal, a complete retreat that would have exposed the entire vanguard to destruction and potentially collapsed the Continental Army's fighting capacity in a single afternoon. This wasn't incompetence anymore. This was a Templar operative trying to hand the British a war-ending victory on a silver platter. Connor was already on the field. His role wasn't to command battalions. It was something far more precise. He was there to neutralize Lee's treachery at the exact moment it mattered most. Connor's intervention prevented Lee's retreat order from taking effect, ensuring the Continental forces held their positions long enough for Washington himself to arrive and personally rally the troops. Washington, furious at what he found, took direct command and organized the defensive line that halted the British advance. The battle ended in a tactical draw, but the strategic implications were enormous. The Continental Army had stood toe-to-toe with British regulars in open combat and it held because one assassin, operating within the chaos of a major engagement, made a single precisely timed intervention that prevented catastrophe. This is what the rebuilt Brotherhood looked like in action, not shadows and hidden blades in dark alleys. A trained operative embedded in the most consequential moments of the revolution, making decisions that altered the course of battles. Connor didn't win Monmouth, Washington did that, but Washington only got the chance because Connor made sure the army was still standing when he arrived. But preventing Lee's betrayal at Monmouth wasn't the end of the story. It was the beginning of the end for Charles Lee himself. The death of Charles Lee. Charles Lee was, by every measurable standard, the most dangerous Templar left standing in the colonies. Not the most powerful, the most dangerous. Because Lee didn't operate in the shadows like a typical Templar agent. He wore a Continental Army uniform. He held rank. He had George Washington's ear, and he used every ounce of that access to sabotage the revolution from the inside. In 1776, Lee was directly involved in a Templar plot to assassinate George Washington. Not metaphorically, an actual assassination carried out through a Templar operative named Thomas Hickey planted inside Washington's personal guard. Connor stopped it by killing Hickey, but the fact that the Templars got that close to ending the revolution with a single knife tells you everything about how embedded Lee's network was. Lee spent years undermining Continental military operations from within, ordering retreats in the middle of winnable battles, feeding intelligence to the British through Templar channels. He wasn't a spy in the traditional sense. He was a general actively trying to lose a war while pretending to fight it. Connor pursued him across multiple years. Every time he got close, Lee slipped away. By 1781, Connor's hunt led him to Fort George, but Lee wasn't waiting for him there. Hatham Kenway was. Connor's own father had been shielding Lee the entire time. The assault ended with Connor killing Hatham in combat, his own father, to get to the man standing behind him, and Lee still escaped. Connor tracked him to a tavern in Monmouth called The Last Drink, and what happened inside is one of the most iconic scenes in the entire franchise, not because of the action, because of the silence. Lee was sitting at a table, wounded, exhausted. He looked up at Connor, and instead of running, instead of fighting, he poured 2 drinks, slid one across the table. Connor sat down and took it. 2 men who had spent years trying to kill each other, sharing a drink at the end of everything. No speeches, no final villain monologue. Just 2 exhausted people acknowledging that the war between them was over. Lee gave Connor a slight nod. Not defiance, not surrender. A quiet recognition that Connor had earned this. Connor drew his hidden blade and stabbed Lee through the heart. There's no triumph in that moment. No swelling music, just a man dying slowly in a tavern while the person who killed him sits beside him, equally broken by everything it took to get there. Lee's death ended Templar influence over American military affairs. Within weeks, Yorktown would fall, and the war would effectively be over. But Connor didn't celebrate. He walked out carrying the weight of every person he'd lost, every compromise he'd made, and every year he'd spent chasing a man who turned out to be just as tired as he was. He'd killed his own father just to reach this moment. And the moment felt like nothing. And with Lee gone, the Templars shattered, and the revolution won, Connor faced a question somehow harder than all of it. What do you do with a brotherhood that barely exists anymore? The rebuilding of the Brotherhood. After the revolution ended, Connor didn't celebrate. He got to work. The Davenport homestead had spent years rotting. The Brotherhood had spent even longer doing the same. Connor's job was to fix both, and he started with his hands. He physically restored the homestead, rebuilt its infrastructure, and transformed it from a monument to failure back into a functioning headquarters. But bricks and timber were the easy part. The hard part was people. Here's the thing. Connor's recruitment strategy looked nothing like what Achilles had built decades earlier. Achilles had recruited elites, Military officers, established operatives with connections and pedigree. Connor went the opposite direction. He recruited common people, frontier settlers who'd survived the war with nothing but calluses and conviction, indigenous warriors from his own Kanyen-Kehaka nation, veterans who'd bled for independence and weren't about to let someone else decide what that independence looked like. He didn't want a hierarchy, he wanted a community, and it worked. In the years following the revolution, the Brotherhood had become genuinely cosmopolitan in a way Achilles never could have imagined. Its ranks included Aveline de Grandpré, the Louisiana assassin who brought an entire southern network with her, Boston apprentices like Duncan Little and Clipper Wilkinson, ordinary people turned into something extraordinary. The Brotherhood's reach now extended into Louisiana, across the eastern seaboard, and throughout the new United States. It was bigger than what Achilles lost, but more importantly, it was different, because that's the real point. Connor didn't rebuild the old Brotherhood, he built a new one. The version Achilles created was powerful, but it was also rigid enough to shatter when pressure hit. Connor's version was built on flexibility, on shared principle rather than centralized authority. It was messier, less elegant, but it bent instead of breaking. Achilles Davenport died peacefully in his sleep in September 1781 at approximately 71 years of age. He'd spent 6 years alone in a decaying house, convinced everything he'd dedicated his life to had been erased. Then a Kanyen-Kehaka kid showed up at his door and proved him wrong. Achilles got to watch the Brotherhood come back. Not the way he'd built it, not the way he'd imagined it, but alive, breathing, growing. The Colonial Brotherhood survived, not because it stayed the same. It survived because one person was willing to tear up the blueprint and start over. And an old man, who'd lost everything, got to close his eyes, knowing it wasn't for nothing. If you enjoyed this video and want to see more, click the video on the screen now.